The former chief of Israel's National Security Council, he said before the attack, the next war will lead to intense suffering among the enemy population, the destruction of homes and infrastructure, and the suffering of hundreds of thousands of people. During the invasion, Israel's foreign minister, Tzipi Livni, she said, Hamas now understands that when you fire on Israel's citizens, it responds by going wild, and that is a good thing, said Ms. Livni. The day after the attack, Ms. Livni went on Israel's Channel 10 News, and she said, Israel demonstrated real hooliganism during the course of the recent operation, which is what I demanded. And then a strange thing happened. A few months later, Ms. Livni was on her way to the UK, and a British court authorized that she could be served with papers for being a war criminal. But Ms. Livni, she was shocked. She was perplexed. She was bewildered. She was certain that real hooliganism was protected by the Geneva Conventions. A former Israeli defense official, he said that with an armada of fighter planes attacking Gaza, Israel decided to play the role of a mad dog for the sake of restoring its deterrence. A former senior Israeli security official, he boasted that Israel had regained its deterrence capacity. How? It has shown Hamas, Iran, and the region that it can be as lunatic as any of them. Lunatic, mad dog, real hooliganism, wild, causing immense suffering. What else could the Goldstone mission conclude except that Israel's leadership launched a deliberately disproportionate attack designed to punish, humiliate, and terrorize the civilian population? Nonetheless, the Goldstone report evoked a huge outcry of outrage across the Israeli political spectrum. Not just what we call the right-wingers in the West, but also the doves. So let's take the case of that Nobel laureate for peace, Shimon Peres. Actually, we should defer to his title because the British recently knighted him, so we should call him Sir Shimon. Sir Shimon, he said that the Goldstone report's a mockery of history, and that Goldstone is a small man devoid of any sense of justice. And then Sir Shimon, he wanted to set the historical record straight for those who are suffering from some misapprehensions. So, anyone here from the West Bank? You want to raise your hand? Okay, just a couple. He said it was Israeli military operations in the West Bank which are what brought economic prosperity there. Anyone here from Lebanon? Okay. He says, what happened in 2006? It was Israeli military operations which liberated Lebanon from the wrath of Hezbollah. They also liberated 1,200 Lebanese from their earthly existence. And then there's Gaza. What happened in Gaza? Well, according to Sir Shimon, it was Israeli military operations that enabled Gaza residents to return to their daily routine. Well, thank you very much, Sir Shimon. And then there's the Israeli ambassador to the United States, Michael Arendt. Some people even think he's a historian. And he said that the Goldstone report was even worse than Ahmadinejad and the Holocaust deniers, which, as you can imagine, is pretty awful. And then back in the United States, Alan Dershowitz of Harvard Law School, he alleged that the Goldstone report is so filled with lies, distortions, and blood libels that it could have been drafted by Hamas extremists. It recalled the protocols of the elders of Zion. He said Goldstone was an evil, evil, evil man, an absolute traitor. You can just imagine how indignant Mr. Dershowitz would have been if he actually read the report. And then, as Sinclair Lewis famously said in Elmer Gantry, every circus needs a clown. So along came Elie Wiesel and said that the report was a crime against the Jewish people. A really interesting question is, why this hysteria over the Goldstone report? The Goldstone report was the last in a long series of reports issued by respected human rights organizations, all of which reached roughly the same conclusions. Amnesty International produced 2 very large reports. Human Rights Watch produced, as of this morning, we're now up to 7 reports on what happened in Gaza. Palestinian human rights organizations issued reports. Israeli human rights organizations issued reports. There were fact-finding missions, and so forth. The Goldstone report, you might say, I have read through all of the reports quite carefully. You might even say the Goldstone report was the most cautious, the most careful, the most judicious, the most circumspect of all of them. So why did Israel become so hysterical? And the answer, I think, is not very hard to find. Mr. Goldstone is not only Jewish, but he is, by his own reckoning, a Zionist. He says, I've worked for Israel all of my adult life. I fully support Israel's right to exist. I'm a firm believer in the absolute right of the Jewish people to have their home there. Mr. Goldstone sits in the Board of Governors of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He's the recipient of an honorary doctorate from the Hebrew University. His mother was an activist in the Zionist movement. His daughter did Zionist immigration to Israel. When Mr. Goldstone was asked, why did you become a human rights lawyer? He said, well, it was because of the Nazi Holocaust. And now Israel had a real problem on its hands. Because for many decades it had honed, it had perfected these ideological weapons in order to discredit any critics of Israel. So if you criticized Israel, you must be an anti-Semite, a self-hating Jew, a Holocaust denier. But Mr. Goldstone's persona and his profession neutralized those weapons. As the Israeli columnist Gideon Levy put it, he said, this time, referring to Mr. Goldstone, this time the messenger is propaganda-proof. Mr. Goldstone, he didn't have the typical profile of an anti-Semite. He didn't seem like a self-hating Jew. He said, I love Israel, I'm a Zionist. He wasn't your run-of-the-mill Holocaust denier, because he said it was because of the Holocaust that I became a human rights lawyer. So, if he was not an anti-Semite, he was not a self-hating Jew, he was not a Holocaust denier, if he wasn't an incompetent or a fool, and the former chief prosecutor of major tribunals couldn't be an incompetent or a fool. And there was only one plausible explanation for why he wrote what he wrote in the report. The only possible explanation is it was true. And so Israel panicked and continues to this day to panic. There were many major repercussions of the Gaza massacre and the ensuing Goldstone report. I'll only focus on one since time is getting late. In many ways, Richard Goldstone is your quintessential classical liberal Jew, a staunch defender of human rights and the rule of law. And more in recent years, it's become impossible to call yourself liberal and defend Israel's conduct. What does liberal mean in the American context, at any rate? To be liberal means to support international institutions, support the rule of law, to support human rights. Amnesty International, it's a liberal organization. Human Rights Watch, it's a liberal organization. And most Jews consider themselves liberal. So in the last presidential election, 80% of American Jews voted for Israel. Even among Latinos, the percentage was nowhere near as high. It was about 67%. Excuse me? What did I say? Excuse me. In the last American presidential election, the last American presidential election, 80% of American Jews voted for Mr. Obama. Latinos wasn't even nearly as close. It was 67%. Among whites in general, it was around 43%. When you factor in income, Jews being by